But before we start out, I just want to do a quick survey. How many of you are familiar with the Book of Ruth? Okay. Good. In my experience, it's not one that gets talked about a lot in church. But it rolled around in the lectionary this year, so I figured I would take a look at it. And hopefully we'll find some new things for those of you who are familiar with it. And if you're not too familiar with it, it'll be a chance to introduce you to a very unusual book. The Book of Ruth is part of the Old Testament. It's in the section that Hebrews call the writings, which is sort of the junk drawer of the Old Testament. It's where they put the stuff they're not sure what else to do with it, so they put it there. And Ruth is kind of unique among the books because it's not about kings or prophets. It's not about these big world-shaking events. It doesn't seem to be about anything particularly important, although actually it is, and we find out about that later. But what the Book of Ruth does is it tells this sort of slice-of-life story about people and relationships in Israel in the late Bronze Age. And it's not just a cute story either. It has something to say to us, 3,000 years later. Let's take a look at the book. The very first line of the Book of Ruth establishes the time frame for us because we're told that this story takes place in the time of the Judges. The time of the Judges is about a 200 to 300 year period between when the land of Canaan was conquered by Joshua, who was leading the Israelites, after Moses. Between then and the crowning of the first king. So this was a time when things were kind of loosey-goosey in the area of Israel. There was no central government. You just had the tribes and the clans, and you had these occasional strong figures that would rise up, and they were called the judges. And they weren't judges in the sense that we think of them as passing sentence, although that was part of what they did. But they were also just military leaders and men and women. There were women also who were powerful in their area. We also know right from the start of the Book of Ruth that the trigger for what happens is a famine that has struck Israel. So it's hard times there, and people, including Naomi and her husband, leave Israel looking for sustenance. In this case, they go to the nearby kingdom of Moab because there's food to be had there. Now, I've thrown some names out at you. So it's a good place to go over maybe a little bit of vocabulary, because if you get to know the names, you can maybe flow a little better with the story. We'll take a look at it. First, there's Naomi. That's actually not a hard name. It means pleasantness in Hebrew. And Naomi happened to be my mom's name. And then there's Ruth. Ruth translates from the Hebrew as companion or friend, or a vision of beauty. And that's not just a random name. We'll see why. And then there's Ruth's sister, Orpah. Orpah's just fun to say. Orpah. It means fawn in Hebrew. And when we're reading it, we kind of trip over it because we want to say Oprah. Here's a bit of trivia for you. When Oprah was born, her parents intended to name her Orpah after Ruth's sister. But when the name got put on the birth certificate and in the birth records, whoever did it transposed the letters to Oprah. And that's why we have Oprah Winfrey instead of Orpah Winfrey. Save that for the next Trivial Pursuit game. Yeah. And then there's Naomi's sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Interesting names. They're not around long, so don't get too attached to them. And then there's Naomi's husband, Elimelech. Elimelech. That's a fun name, too. Kind of like, oh, Orpah. Elimelech. And it, too, has meaning. From the Hebrew, it means, my God is king. So we know that even though Elimelech doesn't stick around for long in the story, his name tells us that he's a righteous man, and that maybe tells us a little bit of something about Naomi herself. And I discovered one thing this week. This is a group participation thing. Saying the name Elimelech is fun. And it's kind of musical. You say Elimelech.
Elimelech.
It just kind of rolls off the tongue. Say it a few times. Elimelech. 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 Cheap joke, had to go there. And, it's good to have a laugh right there because the rest of the story as we hear it is kind of tragic. Naomi and Elimelech and their sons have fled from Bethlehem Ephrathah to go to Moab because of the famine. While they are there in Moab, Elimelech dies. We don't know why, we don't know how, he just dies. Which leaves Naomi with her two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they grow up and they marry a couple of local women, and then they die. Leaving Naomi stuck in this foreign land with two foreign, well, they're native there, but to her they're foreign daughters-in-law. And that was a serious tragedy for its time. Because in that time and place, we're talking somewhere around 3,000 years ago, women were dependent on their men for support. Wives were dependent on their husbands for life itself. And a woman whose husband has died was left with just her sons to take care of her. And if her sons have also died, she's facing some pretty hard times. To say the least, her options are limited at that point. One of the commentaries I read this week, and the writer may have been overstating it, but I get the feeling he wasn't overstating by much, said that a widow with no sons was basically faced with three choices. She could remarry, she could find someone that would have her. She could throw herself on the mercy of her extended family, or she could resort to prostitution. Not all great choices. And stuck there in the land of Moab, Naomi didn't have any extended family that she could throw herself on. We know she didn't have sons that she could turn to, so she was there on her own, depending on her wits and her luck to keep body and soul together. And not only for her, but for her daughters-in-law as well. But then, as the story tells us, just kind of in the nick of time, word comes that the famine in Israel has broken, that there is food to be had. So Naomi decides now is a good time to go back to Bethlehem. she looks at her situation and she looks at her daughters-in-law. And we don't know the thought process here. She may have been thinking purely of them, where they were going to be comfortable. She may have been thinking, oh my goodness, I don't need 2 other people to worry about. But for whatever reason, she tries to talk Orpah and Ruth into staying behind. She said, go back to your families. Start over. Start a new life. And they won't hear of it. And then she really turns on the pressure. She says, you don't want to go to a strange country and try to live there, because it'll be hard. So go back to your mother's home, remarry. You can't wait for me to have another child and then have a son and grow up and marry him. That's a train that's not going to come. I don't think she actually said it that way. So Orpah finally says, okay, you know what, you're right. She goes back to her family. But Ruth is a hard case. And she won't do that. Ruth is devoted to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And here she says, I think, one of the most beautiful lines in the Old Testament, possibly in the whole Bible. Ruth, talking to Naomi, says, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God, and where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. In another context, that would be, romantic. Here it is just incredibly loving and moving and powerful. It's an incredible expression of love and devotion coming from this woman. Because she's showing a willingness to uproot her life for the sake of someone else and to follow that person no matter what happens. In context here, when she says, I will die where you die, and I'll be buried in that foreign land where you are buried. We don't think of it this way. We're not in that same cultural context. But what she is actually saying there, apart from the obvious, is that she's committing herself to a restless afterlife. Sounds kind of weird to us. But in that culture, they believed that your extended family, after you passed away, was responsible for caring for your bones. Treating them respectfully, treating them carefully. And that would give you peace in the afterlife. Ruth was saying, I know I'm not going to have family there. I will have no one to take care of my bones, and I don't care. Because it's worth it for me to be there with you now. And this is where the story of Naomi and Ruth takes on kind of a different energy. Here's where Naomi and Ruth start to work out a plan for their future. It's a plan beyond just moving back to Bethlehem. There's more to it. And one of the things I love about the Book of Ruth is that it shows us that even in Old Testament times, and I just told you how desperate, women's lives could be in that situation. Even in that situation, women were not just passive creatures, waiting for events to unfold and waiting for life to happen to them. But they could use their wits and their strength to chart out a path forward. Even if it meant making it look like someone else was doing the charting for them. There's a trick to that. When I was growing up a long time ago, not long after this happened. When the story of Naomi and Ruth was presented to us, well, first of all, we got kind of an abridged version. There was stuff we're going to talk about next week that wasn't in the version we heard. But the other thing that struck me looking back is Naomi and Ruth were pictured as these kind of obedient, helpless, we'll just go along and see where the wind blows us types. And the reality is very different from that. Naomi and Ruth were women of strength and power and courage. Maybe 50, 60 years ago, my minister wasn't ready for that. But I think we are. But they had strength and power and courage because it takes all those qualities and more to decide that you're going to just uproot your life and move to another country in search of a better life, in search of a better future. In Naomi's case, she did it twice. First, when she moved to Moab and was there for some years, and then when she decided to go back, take Ruth with her. It takes a lot of what my mom called gumption to do something like that. And here's where I think at least one of the places that the Book of Ruth can inform us today. And I've been thinking about how to do this all along here. I'm going to say this apolitically. But I think it's important. Unless you've been unplugged from literally everything in the last couple of weeks, you've been hearing a lot about the issue of illegal immigration. We've heard about people crossing the border, we've heard about the wall, we've heard about caravans driving through Central America headed for the United States. And we've heard all of that stuff, and it has ginned up an awful lot of conversation, well, not conversation, an awful lot of talk. It wasn't conversation, it's people talking at one another. But for all of that, have we ever even stopped to think about the people that we're talking about? There are so many people that enter the country illegally that they just kind of become this faceless horde. It's a statistic. X number of thousands of people. But I think it changes your perspective if you can think about, one of those people or one of those families. What would you say to that one person or that one family if you were at the border and they came and said, you know what? We're leaving behind a hellhole. We need help. You think about Naomi and Ruth, and you think about these people, and you wonder what's gone on in their life to make this look like a good option. What does your life have to look like for you to look at sneaking into another country where you may or may not speak the language and live there under the radar, where you're always under threat of arrest and deportation, you're constantly living in danger of losing everything you work for? If that looks like the best option for you, what does your life look like now? Now, I am not a smart man. Rachel will attest to that. I can give you a list of teachers in my past who will attest to that. I don't know what the solution is. But I've come to suspect, at least, that we're not going to find the solution if we look at these people as criminals or enemies. But instead realizing that they're human beings who are trying to get out from under a crushing burden. If we stop looking at them as problems and start looking at them as people, maybe something will change in the equation. If we stop looking at them as problems and start acknowledging that they're people too, maybe something within them will change, just knowing that they've been heard and that people care about them. If we stop looking at them as problems and start looking at them as neighbors instead, maybe we'll discover solutions nobody's thought of yet, because we've all been focused on trying to win an argument instead of doing our Christian best in the situation. Free and open borders are not a solution, because those bring with them all sorts of other problems. But whatever it is we're doing now doesn't seem like it's working either. I think it is one of the great issues that we have to face as a nation, but really as Christians, that we call ourselves. Now, we've come a little bit far afield from the problems of Naomi and Ruth, who were seeking stability and survival. But maybe not. Because what they're seeking is a place where they can live and thrive and know they have a better future. And as they returned to Bethlehem Ephrathah, they had a plan. We'll find out what that plan was next week. And we'll find out if it worked. And we'll find out what it has to do with Christmas. Because Christmas is coming.